Beauty from the Shelf is a podcast where industry experts fill in the gaps integral to growth for early stage beauty founders and brands. For today's show and to kick off season 4 of the podcast, I'm so excited to be talking with Anna Marie La Venia from the Emerson Group. And we're talking about consumer care. I know some of you might be thinking, what the heck is consumer care? Is that customer service? Yes, it is customer service. And we talk all about the reason why we call it consumer care instead of customer service. I'm making this intro longer than I need to though. Let me go ahead and give you a snippet from the conversation so you can hear a little bit about what Anna Marie has to say.
One thing that we say around the office quite a bit is perception is reality. And so for that consumer, regardless of what we want them to do with that product, their perceived notion of that, we need to understand that. Because if you have a product out there and you want it to be used as a face cream, but it looks and feels like a foot cream, people are going to have a problem. They're going to have a hard time. There's education that's needed behind that.
Let me tell you a little bit about Anna Marie. Anna Marie has been with the Emerson Group for 17 years, covering a variety of different areas of consumer care. She currently leads their team and is a proud member of the Society of Consumer Affairs organization. Anna Marie came on the podcast to give absolutely fantastic insight about how consumer care really relates to a lot of the brand foundations that we talk about a lot on the podcast, knowing who your target consumer is, and also why it's so important to listen to them and some of the benefits that you can gain as a brand if you are listening to them. I know if you're thinking, why should I listen to this podcast if you're a brand founder? If you think about people sliding into your DMs or commenting on your Instagram posts about why they don't like something and how you might be able to respond, that's consumer care. And that's some of what we talk about today. I'm really excited for you to hear what we shared. But before we get into today's episode, I'd like to take a brief moment to thank our sponsor for the podcast, the Emerson Group. Thank you to the Emerson Group for sponsoring the Beauty from the Shelf podcast. Through your sponsorship, we're able to continue to give early stage brands access to the tips and tools for them to grow. Let's go ahead and get into the episode. Let's get right into the podcast and get into these questions. Consumer care is one of those areas of brands that many people don't even recognize exist. I mean, some people might be hearing me say consumer care and scratching their heads going, what the heck is that? Because sometimes you might hear it as customer service. Sometimes the consumer care is the term, I feel like the new term, the refreshed term, and how it is really shared today. So I would love for you to first just explain a little bit about what you think consumer care is, how you define it. Just to make sure we're all on the same page about it. And then I'm excited to talk about how this area impacts early stage brands, all of the brands and different things that can play a role there.
I love it. And, I love that you talked about the evolution of the wording here, customer service to consumer care. And I think, it is important how we talk about it. And I love this idea of consumer care, really thinking about how you care for your consumers. I think, customer service seems more transactional and, caring for your consumer really seems more holistic. And that's really how I think those of us who are in the industry think about this. It's not just answering a question. It's not just dealing with problems. It's really understanding what's happening with the brand. And I think a lot of times people assume, again, that it's just somebody calling and contacting us about the product itself, but consumers have opinions and thoughts on so many things. And if you take the time to really listen to those consumers, so many things can come out of that. And, you have to have a great system to be able to, pull that together, especially when you have a lot of context. But, as a startup brand, it's something that, listening deeply to each consumer, really, you can make a difference and really learn and understand and avoid missteps by listening to, those people who are taking the time to give you their time and feedback.
Thank you for that definition. And also you touched a little bit on how consumer care can be beneficial to early stage brands. So I'd love for you to share some examples of how consumer care has played a role in the success of early stage brands that you may have worked with.
Yeah, thanks for that great question. I have so many examples of how consumer care has played a big role. One of my favorites is really understanding how the way we intake information can benefit the brand. Most recently, we've had a brand, kind of launching on Amazon And we were able to listen to the consumers, and they've been able to make some changes to how they're marketing the brand on Amazon, and then also how they're, differentiating, their product from other products because of what their consumers are sharing with us. And I think, it comes from a couple of things, like I said, being able to categorize that and being able to understand, grouped feedback, but then also really listening deeply to the consumer and really understanding, taking the time to understand what's happening here. Because if we just say, hey, they're having a problem with the product on Amazon, that's one thing. But if we take the time to say, well, why did you think the product would work that way? They're going to give us more information. We're going to be able to give better feedback to that brand owner to make changes and make a difference. So
that's really good. And I know one thing that I've heard a lot of sales folks say is that the customer is always right. and even though I don't necessarily know that the customer is always right, technically, it's like, their perceived truth is still important. Yeah. And that plays a role in how your consumer interacts with your product and what that looks like for them. So I think to your point of like listening to that feedback and making those recommendations, that all just kind of plays into that.
I love how you talked about that. And one thing that we say around the office quite a bit is perception is reality. And so for that consumer, regardless of what we want them to do with that product, their perceived notion of that, we need to understand that. Because if you have a product out there and, you want it to be used as a face cream, but it looks and feels like a foot cream, people are going to have a problem. They're going to have a hard time. There's education that's needed behind that. And this is where, the feedback that we collect and the education that we're able to give the consumer can really help make or break, some of those pieces and help. Again, if you're able to use that feedback and to pivot, off of that feedback, it really helps your brand. And again, avoiding those missteps for the future.
I love that. So I know in the beauty industry, folks don't always think about how consumer care may help build a brand or how that might help build loyalty and trust. I'd love for you to talk about how consumer care and that whole area can really help a brand with those key attributes.
Yeah, consumer care is really, making sure that the consumer is cared for. But when you think about exceptional consumer care, it really has the ability to build a community, to make folks feel like they're part of something that's really bigger than themselves. And when you think about specifically a startup, surrounding yourself with a community can make your marketing dollars go further. And when you have an invested community, they want to give you valuable feedback and they want to help guide how you expand in the future. And having that community behind you and beside you as you grow, really, again, it helps to avoid missteps as you grow. And it keeps you grounded too, I think, in what's important to your core consumer, because that consumer who's calling in, they're investing time in you. And, you honor that by good customer care, good consumer care, good service, and good support.
That's a really interesting point because the folks who are the most vocal have the opportunity to be your greatest influencers, right? And so if you're able to listen to them and really take that feedback and potentially even reach back and say, hey, listen to your feedback and we made that change, you now have someone who might be a forever customer because they're feeling part of that community. They feel heard, they feel seen, and that's so important. And I do think that makes things really sticky and also really creates kind of forever users, if you will, for a lot of brands.
Absolutely.
What are some of the key challenges and opportunities that you see for early stage brands when it comes to setting up and managing effective consumer care systems? I know many times, with AI, there's new tools out there. Everyone doesn't necessarily have a 1-800 number on the back of their product, but people want to have a way to call in. So how do brands, especially early stage, not necessarily a lot of funds, how do you recommend they manage that as they're getting up and running?
Yeah. So, I think you hit it on the head. I'm not going to be super creative in terms of what the challenge is. Resources, right? You need money, right? To have cool tools and AI. But, I would also say that gimmicks aren't always where it's at. Sometimes as larger companies, we have to, get creative and do more automation, in ways to help us, be able to stay with that consumer in the moment that they need us, right? So sometimes AI isn't what you need. Sometimes when you think about the advantage of, a smaller company or startup, it's exactly what I had this experience this morning. There's a framing shop next door and I go there and I get, thank you gifts. It's a little black squirrel because we're from Kent and the black squirrels are kind of a Kent thing. And I went in couple weeks ago looking for, what I usually get. And I asked the owner, I said, hey, do you have the black squirrels? She said, no, we're out. I said, oh, great. I'll come back in a couple weeks. She called me this morning. She said, hey, I noticed I had your number from a framing order you did 6 months ago. I hope you don't mind, but we're back in stock. I wanted to let you know. And, there's no way to scale that, right? That's a scrappy beauty brand, getting into, this is my consumer. I care about you individually, personally, that's really special. And, the one thing I would say is, there's challenges, right? There's, watch outs. And one of the things is if you're providing that on day one, if you don't provide that on day 30, that's a gap for your consumer. And so you have to really think about how you manage and grow that experience. And I think that's where a lot of brands go off course, is as they grow, they don't staff to that level of support. And it really is a lot. You don't think about it, but you want to get to your consumer in a timely manner. You want to meet them where they are. Well, that means you got to staff up for all those places where your consumer is. And that's a lot of things to remember, a lot of ways that you need to kind of integrate data. And that's where, systems come in, right? And systems can help. But you need to plan those things ahead of time and plan those out. And, that's another thing that I would say is, sorry, I'm kind of getting off course here a little bit, but one of the things that I think is important as you start up your consumer care is, a lot of times people kind of don't think about the strategy and they just go in and say, okay, we need a phone number, so we're going to have a phone number. Okay, we need an email, so we're going to have an email. And, I would say that at the beginning, think about where you want to be, where your consumer is most going to want you to be, and be in those places and support the heck out of those places, right? Make sure that as you, go to the future, you're not just having these choices happen to you, but you're really thoughtfully thinking about, how do I want my consumer to experience my brand? And what is that resource going to need to be today, tomorrow, in the future to keep that same level of care?
That's really good. I definitely didn't consider how that consumer care experience matters across the growth of your brand. And to your point, if you're starting off responding to things one-on-one, folks might be expecting that and say, hey, you used to respond to me personally. What's going on? Now I have this automatic response. And it's like, oh, well, I'm only one person and I can't hire someone else. So that's really, really good advice. How do you think brands can use that advice or that feedback that they might get from consumers to improve their products and services? You talked a little bit about, hey, you worked with a brand that had gotten some feedback and they used it to incorporate that. But what does that actually look like? Is it reading all of the comments? Do you have a way to kind of say, oh, this one's coming up a lot? Do you respond to everything? Is there a way that you say this feedback seems like it's important and one to consider? Or this is feedback. We'll always get feedback because we're a consumer brand and we'll add that to our list.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely, you're right. There's so much coming in and so many people, especially as you grow, more people want to share their feedback about your brand. And some of that's going to be for your brand and some of it's not going to be for your brand, right? So I think a couple of things. First of all, having a really good system as to how you categorize, right? And, here at the Emerson Group, we've got 4X. So we have 4 ways of categorizing a call. It goes deep so that you understand from a larger perspective, but then you can drill down within those reason codes to really understand what's happening and how that is, trending over time. Now, there's that piece of it, the how do we, understand what's happening. But then once you're there, I think you're absolutely right. You have to understand, is this for us or is this not for us? And I think that, there are some reason codes on our end that, are product complaints where there's something, potentially wrong with the manufacturing of the product that you really have to, take those seriously. And then, there are suggestions, product suggestions. And I think, training your agents and understanding the difference between, what's an actual problem and what's a suggestion, putting those in 2 separate buckets and then looking through those suggestions and understanding, what aligns with our brand and then what aligns with our core consumer. Because I do think that you have a core consumer, right? I mean, there's going to be a lot of different people who, try your brand and come into your brand. Not all of them are going to stick and not all of them should, I think, to your point of customers always right. There are a lot of customers out there, they're not all yours, right? They might try your product, but they might not be your target consumer. They might not be the person who is going to stay the road with you. And that's good. People should be trying your brand. You should understand who is in for your brand, and people should be understanding that for themselves too, and you want to really commit to that core consumer, especially when you think about a startup, right? You have to really understand, and you may have several segments of people that you want to attract, but if you get too wide with that, then it goes off course. So really understand who that core consumer is and listen to their feedback and appreciate it and reward it.
I love that. It's also so interesting because I talk a lot on LinkedIn and also on the podcast about how that core consumer, I'm like, it always goes back to your core consumer, who they are, they're really important. And so I just love to hear other people say that because I'm like, okay, it's not just me. Okay, we love to hear it. Oh gosh. So going back a bit to actually providing the consumer care. So thinking if that is like responding to an email that's, hello@yourbrandhere.com. What are some cost-effective methods or tools that brands can look towards if they're looking to provide top-notch consumer care without breaking the bank? And I know you talked a little bit about some of the, codes that you have, or reason codes to really dive deep over at the Emerson Group. But I'd love for you to just share any additional metrics or key performance indicators, KPIs that early stage brands could use to track or measure some of the success of their consumer care efforts. And I know I should say this might be more consumer care, might have more of a role for certain brands than others, because certain brands more tied to health and other areas where you're going to probably get more of a response than maybe something that is more topical, if it's like a lotion or something like that. But for some brands, this is a really important part of their business, even in early stages. So that's why, hence the question.
Absolutely. So I think, it's sort of twofold, right? What are some effective tools? And then what are those KPIs that you should be looking at? So I think, in the first part, I think definitely we talked about it, but I'll sing that song again because I think you're onto something here. Know that core consumer, know who they are and cater to those needs. If the thing that's most important to your consumer is, fast returns or, that you stand behind your product, make sure that those are the things that you invest in as a consumer care arm of that agency. And then, expand as your budget allows, right? To focus on greater things, but know that consumer and cater to that core consumer and how you strategize. Limit your channels. I, sort of talked about this before, but if you can't staff for every method of communication, find out who your core consumer is and where they want to talk to you and be there when they need you there. So for some people, that's going to be 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. For some people and some brands, it's going to be, I need you on the weekends or I need you after hours. Find out what that is and, be clear about where you are, but also be clear about where you aren't. So, making that decision up front and making it a conscious choice versus something, again, like I said, that happens to you because you just haven't invested in that or whatever the case is. Make that choice up front. Make sure that it's clear to your consumer, however you communicate to them, hey, we're not on social media or, we don't have an email. Make that clear. Also just maximizing your online communication too. I think, consider building a really great intake form. If web support is important to you, really understand what you want to know from that consumer and build that form, invest there in getting the right information from your consumer in a way that's consistent and convenient for them. And then also, consider business process outsourcing. Working with a BPO where they have established pieces parts can allow you to focus in on different pieces of your consumer care that are really important and allows you to kind of expand with some bandwidth. So thinking about those things, if you're limited on funds, those are some things to maybe think about. And then, when it comes to key performance indicators, I know I have friends in the consumer care industry who will probably dislike me for saying this, but I'll say a lot of people rely on something called CSAT or consumer satisfaction or NPS, Net Promoter Score. Those are pretty standard across the industry. And I'm going to give my most unpopular opinion here and say that I don't love asking consumers for information after I'm done with a call with them. I don't like sending them an email to ask them to rate the consumer or the consumer care or to spend more time than we've already asked of them, right? I don't love that. It also can comment more on your policies than on your agents. There's a lot of things that get into that. So unpopular opinion, but I'm going to say not CSAT or NPS. I'm going to say for me, I'm going to double down on saying that my most essential stat really, as I think about it, is speed to the consumer, right? So how quickly are you responding to that consumer in all of the areas that you're responding to them? And that to me says, I'm getting there. From there, We can look at quality from there. We can look at other things, but getting to that consumer as quickly as possible is something that I find very important. And I think if you really want to look at how well is your consumer being taken care of course, we'll have, one-offs in situations where you can't get to the consumer right away, or problems with, they left the wrong phone number, or the consumer isn't answering, or, whatever the case may be. But really looking at keeping that time to respond to the consumer very fast is something that I'll say tells me that you're focused on the consumer.
I love to hear an unpopular opinion like that, because a lot of times it's like, I know this isn't necessarily what everybody expects, but I think that answer is really rooted in the consumer, what's important to them. And I think if most of us that are listening, think about what it's like, you call customer service and then they say, are you willing to complete a brief survey afterwards? No, I didn't want to call you in the first place. Most of the time I'm calling because there's a problem. Yeah. So no, I don't want to complete a survey. I don't want to say that I would recommend you. I mean, every now and then, if the specialist that I talk to is nice, I will definitely give a nice little, I'm like, okay, I want you to get a promotion, so I'm going to leave you a 10.
Thank you for that. From a consumer care professional, thank you for taking the time when you are asked. It's good.
Hey, I try. But I do think if you think about the consumer, that might look a little bit different, in terms of what they really would expect. Now, look, I will say in your response in talking about effective tools, you did talk about like where the consumer is, communicate with them where they are. And so I'm curious about how you would recommend brands use social media and other digital platforms to engage with consumers and address inquiries and concerns effectively. Because I know people that'll just hop on Instagram and put like, I'm still waiting for my order. And it's like, oh, like in the comments, like has nothing to do with the post, but it's just like, I never got my order, or this product actually took all my hair out. Like whatever it is, just like sometimes it can absolutely get a little wild in social media. So just what are your tips on managing that? That feels like one that would be of a pressing interest for a lot of the brands that might be listening.
It is. It's tricky, right? And I love how you prep that up. You're so right. Sometimes it does come like completely out of the blue and you're like, wow, and to me, stripping back the reaction, it's like you feel very strongly about this, right? Like that's what's at the core of that. So let me start by saying I'm no expert here, and just in full transparency, we don't handle any social media or reviews. It's something that we've looked into extensively and plan for expansion in the future. But one of many reasons that we don't handle these platforms today is because there's, a broad question as to where does this fit even in the organization? So I think, that's a question too. Every company does it differently. And for some it's marketing, for some it's consumer care, for some it's e-commerce. It's a shared responsibility in some organizations. So it's all across the board, right? There's a lot of really sort of generic responses depending on the type of interaction. So when you look at how people do handle it online, a lot of times you'll see something that says, hey, we take every comment seriously. We're going to send you some information in your DM. If you prefer, reach out to our consumer care team, that kind of thing. I think it does a few things. So one, it lets your consumer see that you're responding quickly and taking that complaint seriously. And then two, it puts the ball back in the consumer's court to say, hey, you can engage via this DM. We're giving you an appropriate channel to kind of connect with us where we're not having this, conversation back and forth with potentially your, private information on a very public platform. So, I think that those things are good. I think, some companies have strategies, and it's fascinating to listen to what other people are doing and to watch too, on a public forum, what other people are doing. Some people only answer positive, some people only answer negative. But this is, again, where I think it's one of those things that you have to be really clear with your consumer what you're doing. Because if you say, Monique is posting something positive over here, and I say, hey, thanks, Monique. And, Jody's over here and she's going, hey, this was great. And I don't say anything. That's terrible, right? Like Jody feels like I'm not part of this brand, but Monique is, right? So you want to make sure that experience, I think, is consistent across the board. And, a lot of people are doing it a lot of different ways. And it's just fascinating to watch right now, I think, how people are responding.
Interesting. Are you seeing any clear wins with regards to how folks are responding? So is it like, if you respond to only the negatives, that is kind of seen as being, okay, or folks who respond to everyone are seen as being more connected, more community oriented? Or is it just kind of like it really depends on the brand and the product?
It definitely depends on the brand and the product, I'll say. It's interesting to see even within, companies that have multiple brands, they do it differently with each brand, right? Depending on how invested that brand is, how controversial some of the pieces that are out there. But I think, regardless of whether you're there or not, there's typically a conversation going on about you. And so I think that that's something to think about too, as you think about consumer care. When we look at, TikTok now is the biggest thing that people are sort of talking about, like, are you on TikTok or not, in terms of consumer care support. And, whether you're there as a brand or not, people are making videos that have your product in them. They're making videos about your product. They're talking about your product on that platform. And so do you want to be a part of that conversation, or do you leave that as organic? And I think you're absolutely right when you say it's different for each brand, but I'll say if you're getting into it, you have to support that through, and you have to communicate what you're doing, because I think that's so important. You want to make sure that your consumers don't feel left out, especially those that are posting positive. And then for those that are posting negative, you want to make sure that they understand we're not supporting this. It's not that we're ignoring you. We aren't here, right? And so I think that's important.
Thank you for sharing that. So as we wrap, I'd love for you to share any success stories that you might have about how brands that you might have worked with transformed their business growth through exceptional consumer care practices. And I really ask this question because I think that consumer care is one of those areas that can be a part of a core brand value that can also really generate that brand loyalty and that trust. I think some people overlook it, but especially depending on the product category, I think it could actually be a differentiator that makes people choose your brand over the competition. But I would love to hear, your thoughts on success stories that you've heard with regards to that.
Yeah. And I mean, you're 100% right. When you say it can make or break, a brand, or make or break, that consumer's experience and make them choose one brand over another. I mean, I see so often it's kind of incongruous, the idea that a lot of people kind of forget about consumer care, or sort of, put it on autopilot. And the fact that when you have really good consumer care, it's something that's called out so emotionally by consumers. As you think about like success stories, I think the best brands are true to who they are, and it flows through everything. When you think about standardized responses, you've got to have them, right? There are times when you need to fall back on some specific wording, but there are ways to make that specific wording still have your brand in it. And I think, if you spend the time to really think about how and what differentiates your brand, and you put that into every response that you have in consumer care, and you put that into every policy that you have in consumer care as well, I think those things are success factors. And I also think, I'm going to speak out of both sides of my mouth now, because I'm saying, you need to have these processes in place, and you have to have all these things. But I think those processes become important as setting a standard. But I think it's also important that as you think about your partner in consumer care, that you look at, making sure that those people understand when to make an exception to that process or policy that aligns with your brand values. Because just as those policies and procedures can save us and make sure that we are aligned when it comes to legal issues or things that are really important, as it comes to processes and not doing one thing for one person, doing something else for another, I think it's important to understand that there are situations that, given your brand's mission and vision, are going to require individualized attention. And making sure that you have time and space to identify those situations and to treat them as such is really what takes it from consumer care to, really exceptional consumer care. And I think, in talking about success stories, it's really those people who know who they are and who put that into process policy and understand when to break that policy process in favor of a consumer who needs it, that win.
Wow, I absolutely love that. What a great note to end on, and great advice. It's like, have the processes in place, but also keep in mind that we are human. And sometimes you need to be able to make sure you're listening with both ears so that you can identify if this is a time to stay on the track or to do something a little bit off course, and what those scenarios might be. again, Anna Marie, for joining me on the podcast today. I absolutely learned, as always, I learned some new things, and it's so fun to be able to share this information with the founder community. As always, if you found this helpful, I encourage you to share it with a friend or a colleague. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Bye.